The EU NIS2 isn't a deadline you meet and forget. It is a live, evolving framework that just got a lot sharper. Most companies think they're done because they updated a few policies and adjusted some processes. They're wrong. With the upcoming 2026 amendments, the EU is tightening the screws. And if your compliance is brittle, your compliance program is about to break. In our conversation, we're decoding the 2026 refinement package and give you tangible insights where to go from here. From mandatory ransomware reporting, to the shift from the server room to the boardroom. This is the new roadmap for European digital sovereignty. By the end of this video, you'll have the 5-step blueprint to ensure your program stays standing when the next major incident hits. Let's start at the top. Where are we really with the EU NIS2 right now? Welcome back! Today we're talking about where we are with NIS2 in the EU, and honestly, where the real story is now, which is what comes next. Because a lot of companies went into this thinking NIS2 was a deadline problem. You get to the transposition phase, you update policies, you map incidents, you brief the board, and you're done.
Right, like a very painful compliance project with a finish line.
Exactly, and that is not what this has turned out to be. What we have now is a live framework that's still being tuned in real time. So we'll do a quick recap of what NIS2 is, but then we're going to spend most of this episode on the next phase, the proposals to simplify, tighten, and in some places, expand it.
Yeah, because this is the part business leaders actually need, not another abstract summary of the directive. The question in boardrooms right now is, okay, we've been building toward NIS2. We've been dealing with national implementations. We've been arguing with lawyers, auditors, security teams, and regulators. What changes now?
That's the question. And the answer is, not everything changes tomorrow morning, but the direction of travel is getting clearer.
And maybe a little sharper.
A little sharper. Maybe a lot sharper.
Okay, let's start at the top. Give us the quick recap without turning this into a lecture.
I'll do my best. NIS2 is the EU's broad cybersecurity resilience framework for critical and important sectors. It replaced the earlier NIS regime with a bigger scope, stronger supervision, more detailed risk management expectations, incident reporting obligations, and direct accountability at the management level. That last part matters. This is one of those rules that really pushed cyber out of the server room and into the boardroom.
That's the line, by the way. NIS2 moved cyber from the server room to the boardroom.
It did. And it did that in a very practical way. Medium and large entities in covered sectors generally came into scope. The framework split entities into essential and important, with different supervisory intensity. It also pushed organizations to get serious about things they used to treat as side topics: supply chain security, vulnerability handling, business continuity, incident response, crisis communications, governance, all of it.
And that sounds neat on paper, but in practice, companies hit the wall pretty quickly.
Yeah, no, exactly. Because the directive gave a common EU model, but the actual implementation landed through member states. And once you get into real companies, especially multinational groups, life gets messy. Different corporate structures, different national registration processes, different regulator expectations, different interpretations of scope, different reporting habits. So what a lot of firms discovered was this. NIS2 was supposed to harmonize cyber resilience, but the first wave of implementation still felt fragmented.
Which is why so many teams have been asking, wait, do we have one program or 27 versions of a program?
Right. And the honest answer has often been both. You need one enterprise control framework, but you also need local compliance plumbing. That tension is really the backdrop for the latest proposals.
Okay, so let's get into the real issue. When people say, where are we today with NIS2? What they usually mean is, are we in a stable place, or are we still in the middle of a redesign?
We are not in a stable, settled end state. We are in an active refinement phase. The EU has now made pretty clear that it wants to keep the core logic of NIS2, but smooth out the parts that are creating friction. And that's important. This is not a demolition job. They are not throwing NIS2 away. They're saying, we've learned from transposition and early implementation. We can see where the ambiguity and burden are, and now we're going to tighten the framework.
So this is version 2 energy, but not a full reboot.
That's exactly it. It's a recalibration. And the recalibration is happening in a broader cybersecurity package, which matters because the logic is bigger than just incident reporting forms or definitions. Underneath the simplification language, there's a deeper theme here: digital resilience, supply chain control, and frankly, strategic autonomy.
Yeah, let's sit with that for a second. Because one thing I think a lot of people miss is that this is being presented as simplification. And some of it absolutely is. But there's another current underneath it. This is also about who Europe depends on, where critical technology comes from, and how much control regulators want over that risk.
That's right. Simplification on the surface, sovereignty underneath. And when you look at what's being proposed around the wider cybersecurity package, that theme gets very obvious.
Which means if you're a business leader listening to this, do not read simplification as relaxation. That would be a huge mistake.
Huge mistake. Simplification here is mostly about standardizing expectations, reducing duplicate effort, and giving authorities better line of sight across borders. That can reduce cost at the margins, but it can also make supervision more coherent and, in some cases, more effective.
Okay, so let's break this down. What are the biggest what's next themes people need to understand?
The first one is harmonization of controls, and this is a big deal. The direction now is toward more EU-level specificity for certain cybersecurity risk management measures. In plain English, where the Commission sets technical or methodological requirements for covered entities, member states would have less room to layer on their own extra requirements for those same measures.
Which, on paper, sounds like relief.
It is relief for companies that operate across multiple countries and are tired of building the same control evidence pack 5 different ways. If you've got a centralized cyber program, this matters a lot. Because what you want is one baseline control architecture that travels, one testing approach, one evidence library, one governance model you can explain consistently.
One set of scars.
Exactly. One scar tissue repository. But there's a nuance here. Harmonization does not mean you can stop paying attention locally. It means the center of gravity may shift upward over time. So the smart move now is not to freeze and wait. The smart move is to design a portable control framework that can absorb more EU-level standardization when it comes.
That's a really important distinction, because I can already hear some people saying, well, if more harmonization is coming, maybe we slow down.
No, don't do that. Current national rules still matter. Current obligations still apply. This is not a pause your NIS2 program moment. It's a stop building a brittle program moment.
That's a clip. Stop building a brittle program.
Because brittle compliance is what breaks first when the framework evolves.
All right, second theme.
Certification. The proposals point toward a stronger role for EU-wide cybersecurity certification as a route to demonstrating compliance. That sounds technical, but the business implication is simple. Organizations may eventually be able to use recognized cyber posture certification as part of how they prove they meet certain NIS2 requirements.
And the attraction is obvious. Fewer repetitive audits, fewer bespoke regulator conversations, less of that send us the same evidence in a slightly different spreadsheet problem.
Exactly. But let me put a warning label on this. Certification can become a useful compliance accelerator. It is not a transfer of responsibility. If you get certified and still fail operationally, you own the failure. The board owns the governance failure. Management owns the risk decision. A certificate is evidence. It is not absolution.
That part cannot be said enough. A certificate is not a force field.
No. And if companies treat it that way, they're going to get hurt. The better way to think about certification is this. It may become a more portable way to show maturity and reduce duplication, especially across borders. But the underlying discipline still has to be real.
And honestly, that is a pattern across cyber regulation generally. The paperwork only helps if the operating model underneath it is alive.
Well said.
Third theme, scope, because this is where people's eyes glaze over until suddenly they realize they're in scope.
Exactly. Scope is boring right up until it lands on your budget. What's next here is not just expansion, it's refinement in both directions. Some categories are being clarified because the original text created uncertainty. Areas like healthcare, electricity, hydrogen, chemicals. Some smaller entities may fall out in certain cases, but at the same time, new categories are being drawn in.
And this is the key point, right? Scope is not just getting bigger, it's getting more precise.
Yes, more precise, but also more strategic. You can see the EU looking at the digital infrastructure it considers increasingly critical and asking, are there gaps? Are there operators we missed? Are there sectors where legal drafting was too fuzzy? That's why you see the attention on things like digital identity wallet providers, business wallet providers, submarine data transmission infrastructure, and strategic dual-use infrastructure.
Submarine cable infrastructure is such a perfect example of how this conversation has changed. A few years ago, that felt niche. Now it feels obvious.
Exactly. Because once you look at modern dependency chains, it's not niche at all. And that's really the story. NIS2 is moving from a classic critical sector lens to a dependency lens. What infrastructure, service, or provider creates systemic cyber risk if it fails, gets compromised, or becomes strategically exposed?
That shift matters far beyond the companies directly named in the text. It tells you how regulators are thinking.
Right, and for companies, the takeaway is straightforward. Scope analysis is no longer a one-time legal memo. It has to be a recurring management process, annual at minimum, more often if you're restructuring, acquiring, launching new services, or changing digital architecture.
Because if your operating model moves faster than your legal scoping review, you can end up non-compliant without meaning to.
Exactly.
Okay, let's go to the part multinational groups care about the most, cross-border supervision, because this is where theory and reality tend to have a fistfight.
That's putting it nicely. Cross-border supervision has been one of the hardest practical issues. A lot of groups run cybersecurity centrally, one CISO function, one security stack, one procurement model, one incident response structure. But the legal entities are spread across multiple member states, and national implementation hasn't always mapped neatly to how those groups actually operate.
And that's where people got tripped up on this idea that one main establishment or one central decision center would solve everything.
Yes, and in practice, that has not always worked as cleanly as companies hoped. One thing that's good to know is that some national guidance has effectively reinforced a legal entity view rather than a group-wide view. So a centralized security model inside the group does not automatically mean one regulator, one filing, one set of touchpoints.
That's brutal for international groups, because the real-world security decisions may be made centrally, but the compliance obligations still show up locally.
That's exactly the problem. And what the new proposals try to do is not magically erase that complexity, but manage it better. ENISA's role gets stronger. There's a bigger emphasis on cross-border visibility, mutual assistance, joint supervisory actions, and a registry of entities. That matters because it gives authorities a more structured way to deal with cross-border risk, instead of each country improvising in isolation.
So the message is better coordination, not a perfect one-stop shop.
Correct. Better coordination, not a miracle. And companies need to internalize that. You still need a very disciplined map of your EU legal entities, your registrations, where services are offered, where systems are located, who your representatives are, and where your so-called main establishment arguments are actually defensible.
Which sounds administrative, but it is not just administrative. That data becomes governance infrastructure.
Exactly, because when regulators ask questions during an incident or during supervision, confusion about legal structure becomes a risk multiplier.
And the proposals tighten some of that operational detail too, right? Faster updates, more information in the registry, more visibility into who's where?
Yes, which is another sign that NIS2 is maturing from broad principle into operating mechanics. This is where compliance starts feeling less like a policy binder and more like data management.
That is such a good point. Cyber regulation is increasingly a data quality problem.
If your entity inventory is wrong, your regulator map is wrong. If your regulator map is wrong, your incident pathways are wrong. And if those are wrong when something goes sideways, you're in a bad place fast.
All right, next theme, ransomware, because this part is very concrete.
Very concrete. The proposals push toward more structured ransomware reporting. Not just, we had an incident. More detail. Was ransomware detected? What was the attack vector? What mitigation steps were taken? And on request, did the organization receive a ransom demand? Who made it? Whether payment was made? How much? Through what means? And to whom?
That's a big operational shift, because that is no longer generic incident notification. That is building an evidentiary record while you are under pressure.
Exactly. And this is where a lot of companies need to mature fast. Incident response plans have to do more than contain the attack. They have to preserve the information needed for regulatory reporting, law enforcement engagement, insurance handling, executive decision-making, and potentially litigation.
And let's be honest, in a real ransomware event, people are exhausted, systems are unstable, outside counsel is on the phone, forensics is scrambling, operations wants to restore, finance wants impact numbers, communications wants statements, and the CEO wants a decision in 10 minutes.
That's the reality, which is why the lesson here is, if your playbook doesn't already capture ransomware-specific facts, decision trails, and ownership, fix that now. Not later. Now.
And there's another layer. The minute regulators start asking about payment details, crypto asset pathways, recipient information, and mitigation attempts, you're dealing with a very different level of scrutiny.
Yes, and that has governance implications. Who decides whether to pay? What approvals are required? What sanctions screening is built in? What documentation is privileged? What gets recorded in the board briefing? These are no longer hypothetical edge questions.
Which brings us to a bigger point. NIS2 is not just a security framework. It is a decision-making framework.
Exactly. Cybersecurity regulation is increasingly judging the quality of management decisions under stress.
That's a line every board member should hear twice.
Because it's true.
Let's talk supply chain now, because this is where the wider package really changes the atmosphere. Even if a company is focused narrowly on NIS2, the surrounding direction of travel matters.
It does. And here's the thing. NIS2 always had a supply chain dimension. But the broader 2026 package makes that conversation more strategic. The EU is not just asking whether your vendors have controls. It is increasingly asking whether your dependencies create systemic, geopolitical, or sovereignty risk.
So this stops being, did we send our vendor questionnaire, and starts becoming, what are we actually dependent on? Who controls it? How hard is it to unwind? And what happens if regulators decide that dependency is no longer acceptable?
That's exactly where this is going. And even inside the NIS2 amendments, you can see a move toward more consistent treatment of supplier information requests, because the current state has created a lot of burden. Everybody is firing different questionnaires at the same suppliers, asking for overlapping detail in different formats. That's inefficient, so expect more standardization there.
Which sounds like mercy for suppliers.
It is, but it's also a sign that regulators want cleaner, more comparable supply chain data. And once that data gets cleaner, supervisory expectations usually get sharper.
Right. Better formatting is rarely the end of the story.
No, better formatting is usually the beginning of better enforcement.
Let's touch on one more forward-looking issue that I think people may overlook because it doesn't feel urgent yet. Post-quantum.
Yeah, this is subtle but important. The proposals point to post-quantum cryptography transition as something that should show up in national cybersecurity strategy. That doesn't mean every company needs to rip out its encryption tomorrow. But it does mean the policy signal is now unmistakable. Crypto agility is moving from future topic to planning topic.
So not panic, inventory.
Exactly. Inventory where you rely on cryptography, where long-lived data matters, where critical authentication depends on legacy assumptions, and how difficult migration would be. The companies that start mapping now will look smart later.
And the companies that wait until it's urgent will say, wow, this is more embedded than we thought.
Which is what always happens.
I want to bring in the privacy angle for a second, because that's another reason this next phase matters. We're already seeing the message that yes, streamline reporting, yes, use certification intelligently, but do not create a giant side effect where personal data gets processed more broadly than necessary.
That's right. Cybersecurity and privacy are not opponents, but they are not automatically aligned either. As reporting channels consolidate and certification becomes more prominent, organizations need governance that keeps those streams disciplined. Limited data, clear purposes, defined retention, good access controls. Otherwise, simplification on one side becomes sprawl on the other.
So if I'm a GC, CISO, risk officer, or board member listening to this, the real question is not, what will the final law say word for word? The real question is, what program do I build now that still works if these changes land?
That's exactly the right question. And I think the answer has 5 parts.
Okay, give me the practical version.
First, keep complying with current national NIS2 requirements. Do not wait for simplification. Second, build one portable evidence architecture across the EU. One control library, one policy stack, one testing logic, one board reporting model. Third, refresh your scope analysis, because the perimeter is moving. Fourth, harden your incident and ransomware playbooks so they capture the facts regulators are likely to want. And fifth, treat legal entity mapping, registrations, and supervisory touchpoints as core control data, not admin trivia.
That's really the heart of it. NIS2 used to feel like a cyber project. What's next is much broader. It's legal structure, regulatory coordination, vendor strategy, certification strategy, crisis management, and executive accountability.
Yes, NIS2 is no longer just a compliance project. It's an operating model decision.
There it is.
And maybe the biggest mental shift is this. Stop asking whether you are done with NIS2. Most organizations are not done. They are moving from implementation into managed adaptation.
Managed adaptation. I like that because it sounds less glamorous than transformation, which is probably why it's accurate.
Exactly. It's the work after the headline.
Before we close, let's do a straight answer round. If you're a CEO, what should you hear in all of this?
Cyber resilience is now part of enterprise strategy, not just technical hygiene. Ask whether your NIS2 program is portable across jurisdictions, whether your leadership team can make fast decisions during a ransomware event, and whether your critical technology dependencies are understood at board level.
If you're a board member,
don't ask only whether management is compliant today. Ask whether the program can absorb regulatory change without breaking, and ask how management is documenting accountability.
If you're a general counsel,
Map the entity structure, reporting pathways, notification triggers, and decision rights now. Particularly for cross-border incidents, you do not want to figure out your governance in the middle of the crisis.
if you're a CISO,
Build for evidence, not just control. A good security program that can explain itself under supervision is going to struggle.
and if you're sitting there in a multinational group thinking, we already centralized all of this, so we should be fine?
Maybe, but verify it. Centralized security does not automatically mean centralized compliance. That assumption has burned a lot of people.
That might be the cleanest takeaway from this whole episode.
It's definitely one of them.
All right, final thought from me. I think what's interesting here is that the EU seems to be saying two things at once. One, we hear you. The first wave of NIS2 implementation has been uneven and burdensome in places. And two, we are not stepping back from cyber regulation. We are getting more specific about how critical digital resilience should work, especially across borders and across supply chains.
I think that's exactly right. And that's why leaders need to read this moment correctly. This is not deregulation. It is maturation. The framework is becoming more operational, more strategic, and more integrated with broader questions of infrastructure trust, market resilience, and public policy.
So the companies that win here are not the ones that treat every update like an interruption.
Right. They're the ones that build a program sturdy enough to evolve.
And maybe that's the real headline. Cyber rules are no longer occasional storms. For major businesses, this is just the climate now.
That's well put.
All right, that's where we'll leave it. Where are we today with EU NIS2? We're past the theory stage. The core regime is here, the next wave of amendments is taking shape, and the smart move is not to wait for the final punctuation mark. It's to build a governance model that can survive the next draft, the next regulator question, and the next incident.
Clear head, solid plan.
Exactly. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time.